3 knocks on the bronze door with a hammer is a signal the world knows. With this act, which is done by the Pope, Christians worldwide know they will experience a special year. The doors of the first church in Rome open, and so do the doors of forgiveness for women who have had abortions, or the doors to understanding those who follow the Jewish and Islamic faiths. What has the church changed since past Jubilees? What is the purpose of having these special times in the church? What inspires millions of Catholics to travel all the way to Rome? Pope Francis was appointed after the resignation of Pope Benedict XVI, who still resides in the Vatican. The first recorded Jubilee took place in 1300. It was started by Pope Boniface VIII, who also lived alongside a former pope. The difference is that Pope Boniface VIII did not have a cordial relationship with his predecessor like the one Pope Francis and Pope Benedict XVI share. We are in Fumone, a few miles outside of Rome. This is the castle where Pope Celestine V was jailed after resigning from his post. Pope Boniface VIII, his successor, decided to imprison him for fear his political enemies could use Celestine V against him. Being the supreme pontiff included governing the papal states. It was a symbol of the spiritual power joined with jurisdiction over many territories that each had a lot of properties. The Marquis of Longhi, to whom this castle belongs to, accompanies us inside the cell where the emeritus pope was held.
Il motivo per cui Celestino V venne messo in una prigione di Stato.
When Pope Celestine V was made a prisoner of the state, it was a very serious event and also a very important event. During the time of his resignation, which took place in December 1294, he was promised the freedom to continue what he did before he had become the Pope.
Promesso a Celestino di riottenere la libertà di...
This essentially meant being a hermit. He would have to live alone in the mountains, though he would be living in total freedom. But this wasn't possible, because the enemies of the church used this opportunity for their own advantage and took things into their own hands.
Ne avrebbero approfittato per utilizzarlo come un proprio mezzo nelle loro mani.
The imprisoned pope lived in harsh conditions. Pope Celestine V was in this very tiny cell for 10 months, leading up to his death.
Le prigioni del castello di Fumone erano ubicate nella...
The Castle Fumone prisons were located in the castle's underground dungeon.
Ma questo non poteva avvenire nel caso.
But they weren't made for prisoners like that for various reasons.
Per varie ragioni. La principale è perché ovviamente non si poteva pretendere.
The main one is because it could not be expected for the guards, in this case, to protect the keeper of the castle, who was also a military man of high rank, and to pass their days controlling this illustrious prisoner.
Diciamo nel controllo di questo prigioniero illustre.
An autopsy done in the 19th century revealed a hole in Pope Celestine V's cranium.
Il foro che ha nel teschio ha una forma irregolare, una forma classica.
The hole that he had in his skull was irregular. It was in the shape of a classic nail during the medieval era. This led us to believe that the one who sent him to this prison was actually Benedetto Caetani. He was sent there by a pope. Pope Boniface VIII was the architect of his death.
E cioè Benedetto Caetani, Papa Bonifacio VIII, fosse anche l'artefice della sua morte.
Despite what his enemies might say, the reality is that Pope Boniface VIII was a dedicated pontiff. He won the Roman people over by his concern for social problems.
Come Papa anche senz'altro era...
This Pope, Pope Boniface VIII, was an incredibly generous and altruistic person to those in need, and he almost certainly wouldn't miss a religious ceremony. He wouldn't miss it for the world.
Senz'altro è un Papa che non perdeva una cerimonia religiosa per nessuna ragione al mondo.
Against this historical backdrop, something surprising happened in Rome.
Bonifacio e la curia si sono trovati di fronte alla Boniface and the Curia were confronted on Christmas Eve of the year 1299 with a strong presence of people asking for the centenary celebration. Both citizens and non-citizens were present. They were surprised. It was an unusual request, but he didn't want to waste the opportunity of the great centenary, the centenary year of the birth of Christ, of course.
Non era mai parlato di un grande perdono in occasione dell'anno centenario della nascita di Cristo, ovviamente.
Inspired by all the people's fervor, Pope Boniface VIII decided to start the Jubilee in Rome. It was the first Jubilee in history.
I grant complete indulgence to all Christians who travel to Rome to visit the grand sanctuaries of St. Peter and St. Paul.
All pilgrims were promised to be forgiven for all their sins, every single one, from murder to adultery. They simply had to confess with a priest. In addition, the purgatory time for these sins was eliminated. It was a golden opportunity for anyone who wanted a fresh start in life. These people might have cheated, murdered, kidnapped, or been sexually impure. They all feared a divine punishment. It's estimated that around 200,000 people visited the Eternal City that year.
Le testimonianze del tempo sono tutte concordi. Folle.
The testimonies of the time are all unanimous. People coming to Rome. They create problems, even for survival, because the food was all exhausted. Therefore, it was necessary to take urgent measures. Mechanisms were established to receive food from the entire area surrounding Rome to feed the crowd. Dante mentions it. He spoke of the famous bridge that he had to go through. They had to make 2 lanes, one to go to St. Peter's and another returning from St. Peter's. So there were many people in Rome.
Da San Pietro, quindi c'era proprio tantissima gente a Roma.
Pilgrimages would usually be done on foot. The very wealthy would do the journey on horseback. But everyone had to take the same treacherous trails, the same roads that the thieves would hide out in. The best lodging back then would be considered substandard today. Europe was living through the Iron Age at the beginning of the 14th century. On one hand, the 100-Year War had begun. The old continent was ripped in half during this time. On the other hand, the Ottoman Empire had extended all along the east. There was a lack of order. Personal disputes and violence occurred daily. This view from Rome was worth all the effort. We are on the lookout of Monte Mario. This is where the pilgrims would have their first panoramic view of the Eternal City after a long trip. The records from this period say that many would kneel at this column and cry tears of joy upon seeing Rome. They arrived to St. Peter's by way of Via Francigena, a 2,000-kilometer path that starts at the Canterbury Cathedral in England. It runs through France from north to south, then crosses Switzerland. It enters Italy through the north. Close to 80 stages make up the journey, which ends when pilgrims arrive at St. Peter's tomb.
Via Francigena, the path that pilgrims traveled on, is filled with environmental beauty because it passes landscapes like the Alps of the Aosta Valley to the rice fields of Vercelli, and then the Apennines. After the Apennines comes Liguria, Tuscany, and Lazio. So I would say there is a wonderful variety of scenery.
The road these pilgrims took, the so-called Romeri, has been hidden behind big highways and commercial roads. But since the end of the 20th century, there have been attempts to recover it. Fidenza is one of the towns the road runs through. A former mayor, Massimo Tedeschi, is promoting the restoration of this road.
La Via Francigena, insomma, bisogna essere chiari, la Via Francigena vuole emulare, no, il successo.
The Via Francigena is similar to the Camino de Santiago, the lay and religious pilgrimage to the tomb of St. James and the pilgrimage to the tomb of St. Peter in Rome.
Tomba di Pietro a Roma.
There are many similarities between these pilgrimages in Italy and Spain.
Nel nostro caso l'Italia.
But today, Via Francigena has fewer pilgrims venturing towards Santiago.
Un numero di camminatori e di pellegrini inferiore a quello di Santiago.
It is symbolic that the first holy year in history was convoked in Rome only 9 years after the Kingdom of Jerusalem had been lost. In fact, the Jubilee had been an unforeseen effect. After the loss of the last Christian fortress in the area, traveling to the Holy Land was extremely dangerous. Rome or Santiago de Compostela were the alternatives.
Nasce anche un altro aspetto importante che riguarda la città di Roma.
And so a new concept was born, Rome as the New Jerusalem. People could no longer visit Jerusalem, the place where the Lord was born, raised, and eventually killed. Rome, the city where the apostles Peter and Paul passed to heaven, is instead deemed the replacement. Rome as New Jerusalem is even configured on a topographical map. And so the new city is born, Santa Croce in Jerusalem, the true cross, and Peter and Paul's tombs are laid out. They represent a whole series of places that, in a certain way, rebuild Jerusalem. But it also names Rome a place of great Christian pilgrimage.
Roma come luogo del grande pellegrinaggio cristiano.